The chill of a London December, usually a harbinger of a certain festive merriment, seemed this particular evening to wear a cloak of rather more sombre hue. Outside our snug Baker Street rooms, the gas lamps cast elongated shadows upon the damp pavement, and the occasional passer-by, muffled in greatcoat and scarf, appeared as a hurried spectre in the swirling mist. I, Dr. John Watson, found myself poring over the day's Standard, yet my thoughts, as they so often did, drifted from the mundane reports of parliamentary wrangling and foreign skirmishes to the extraordinary mind of my companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He sat opposite me, his long, lean figure silhouetted against the roaring fire, a sheaf of newspaper cuttings scattered about him. His chemical apparatus, which often adorned our sitting room with the aroma of forgotten experiments, was for once quiescent. He appeared to be studying some abstruse monograph on ancient cryptology, his keen eyes scanning the dense text with an intensity that suggested a far deeper engagement than mere curiosity. "Watson," he remarked without lifting his gaze from the page, "your thoughts, I perceive, are entangled in a web of conjecture concerning the inherent contradiction of human nature during the festive season. You ponder how the outward gaiety of Yuletide can so often mask the deepest currents of malice, envy, and despair." I confess, a slight start ran through me. "Holmes, your powers of observation are, as ever, unnerving." I was indeed reflecting upon the curious juxtaposition of joyous celebration and the perennial prevalence of human folly, particularly as the season of goodwill approaches. He finally looked up, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "A sound observation, my dear fellow. The veneer of civilization is often thinnest when subjected to the pressures of social obligation and heightened emotion. The very traditions designed to foster camaraderie sometimes serve merely to amplify dormant resentments. Indeed, I had just concluded a rather dry treatise on the linguistic roots of various ancient seasonal rites, and your very thought, Watson, serves as a most timely, if somewhat morbid, illustration." At that precise moment, a sharp rap echoed through the quiet rooms, followed by the hurried footsteps of Mrs. Hudson. A moment later, she ushered in a figure whose very appearance bespoke a profound distress that seemed incongruous with the festive decorations that still adorned the landing. Our visitor was a gentleman of middle age, impeccably dressed, yet his face was pallid, his eyes wide and haunted, and his hands trembled as he clutched a silk top hat. "Mr. Holmes," he stammered, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion, "my name is Sir Alistair Finch. I beg you, sir, you must come at once. There has been a most ghastly incident, an unspeakable tragedy at my cousin's Christmas ball. A young lady dead, and in such a fashion as defies all explanation." Holmes rose, his languid air instantly replaced by an electric keenness. "Pray, compose yourself, Sir Alistair. Explain the circumstances clearly. Where is this ball, and what precisely has occurred?" Sir Alistair sank into the armchair I indicated, attempting to regain his breath. "At Lord and Lady Ashworth's annual Christmas Eve ball, Mr. Holmes. A veritable who's who of society, a glittering assembly. My cousin, Miss Evelyn Fairchild, was amongst the guests. A debutante, Mr. Holmes, barely 19, beautiful, vivacious. And now she's gone." He wrung his hands. The ball was in full swing, the music enchanting, the hall ablaze with light and laughter. Later in the evening, some of the younger set decided to play blind man's bluff in the smaller drawing room, where the lighting could be dimmed for added sport. The room was mostly dark, save for the faint glow from the hallway, and, as is custom, a bough of mistletoe hung prominently from the ceiling. "Continue, Sir Alistair," Holmes prompted, his eyes fixed intently on the distraught man. "The game was progressing merrily," he continued, his voice trembling anew. Miss Fairchild was among the participants. One of the guests, blindfolded, was stumbling about, trying to catch someone. There was much giggling and feigned struggles. Then, suddenly and quite inexplicably, the lights in the drawing room went out completely. Plunged into utter darkness, Mr. Holmes, for perhaps 10 seconds, no more. There was a general gasp, then a few nervous laughs, and then the lights flickered back on. Sir Alistair paused, a profound shudder racking his frame. And there she was, Mr. Holmes, Miss Fairchild, lying on the polished parquet floor directly beneath the mistletoe, utterly still, lifeless. I felt a cold prickle of apprehension. A high society ball, a parlour game, a sudden blackout, and death. This was a scenario ripe for Holmes's unique talents. "And the nature of her injuries, Sir Alistair?" Holmes asked, his voice calm, cutting through the man's evident horror. "That is the most confounding aspect, Mr. Holmes. There was no struggle, no sound, merely a silence. Then her discovery. The doctors, when they arrived, found only a tiny puncture wound, barely visible, high on her neck, just beneath her left ear. A pinprick, almost. No blood. No obvious weapon. The police, well, they are quite at a loss. They speak of a fainting spell, a weak heart, but Evelyn was robust, healthy. It simply defies belief. It was murder, Mr. Holmes, I am certain of it. And it happened in those 10 seconds of darkness." Holmes rose, drawing on his overcoat. "Indeed, Sir Alistair. The peculiar circumstances alone suggest something far more sinister than a mere fainting spell. Watson, my dear fellow, our services are required. Fetch your bag. It appears we are to attend a most unconventional Christmas ball." The Ashworth residence in Belgravia was, even under the shadow of tragedy, a magnificent edifice of Victorian opulence. Its imposing facade, usually alight with 1,000 festive lamps, now seemed to wear a more subdued glow. Yet within, the lingering grandeur of the previous night's revelry was palpable. Footmen moved with hushed reverence, their usual bustling efficiency tempered by the pall of sudden death. We were led directly to the drawing-room, a chamber of considerable proportions, adorned with sumptuous velvet draperies, intricate plasterwork, and an array of priceless antiques. In the centre, where the unfortunate Miss Fairchild had fallen, a dark stain on the polished floor had been hastily covered by an oriental rug. Above, from a magnificent chandelier, hung a bough of mistletoe, now imbued with a macabre significance. Several figures were present. Lord Ashworth, a portly man of 50, with a perpetually flushed face, now pale and agitated. Lady Ashworth, a formidable woman with an air of brittle composure, fluttering a lace handkerchief. And a rather corpulent police inspector, Lestrade, whose face already bore the familiar lines of baffled frustration. "Holmes!" Lestrade exclaimed, spotting us. "I confess I am delighted to see you. This case, it is quite beyond me. The young lady, Miss Evelyn Fairchild, dead. No struggle, no sound, save for a general gasp when the lights failed. And the cause? A pinprick, Holmes, a mere pinprick. Holmes offered a terse nod, his eyes already sweeping the room, taking in every detail with an almost predatory intensity. He ignored Lestrade's lamentations, his gaze fixed on the mistletoe, then on the rug, and finally, with a slow, deliberate movement, he began to examine the surrounding floorboards, his magnifying glass held aloft. "Pray, Inspector," Holmes murmured, without looking up, "inform me of the precise sequence of events. Who was present in this room during the game of blind man's bluff?" Lestrade, relieved to have some direction, supplied a list of names. A dozen or so young people, mostly debutantes and their escorts. Miss Fairchild, of course, a Miss Isabella Thorpe, another debutante, a Mr. Julian Thorne, a suitor by all accounts of both young ladies, and a few others, all of whom swear they heard nothing untoward in the dark. Holmes knelt, his face almost touching the floor, his long fingers methodically tracing the grain of the wood. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe the specific placement of the mistletoe, directly above where the victim fell. A symbolic location, I dare say, for a death so sudden and perplexing." I nodded, my gaze following his. The drawing-room, with its remnants of festive cheer, scattered ribbons, a half-eaten plate of mince pies, wilting floral arrangements, now seemed eerily silent, the ghosts of laughter and music replaced by a chilling stillness. After several minutes of intense scrutiny, Holmes straightened up, a glint of triumph in his eyes. He held a small object delicately between his thumb and forefinger. "Aha, Watson, our first tangible clue, and a most illuminating one." He presented it to me. It was a tiny, perfectly spherical bead, no larger than a pea, with a faint iridescence. "A pearl, Holmes?" I inquired, examining it. "Perhaps from Miss Fairchild's necklace." Holmes's lips twitched in a slight, knowing smile. "A perceptive thought, my dear Watson, and one I anticipated. Miss Fairchild, as I have ascertained from the servants, was indeed wearing a magnificent pearl necklace, a family heirloom last night. However," he continued, turning the bead over, "this, Watson, is not a pearl. Observe its weight, its density, the subtle imperfections. This, my dear fellow, is a glass bead. A very high-quality one, perhaps, designed to imitate a pearl, but glass nonetheless." He then carefully examined the victim's necklace, which had been removed by the medical officer. "As you see, Watson, every pearl is accounted for, and all are of genuine luster. This glass bead, therefore, is extraneous. It did not originate from Miss Fairchild." Lestrade, who had been watching Holmes's movements with his usual blend of admiration and bewilderment, puffed out his cheeks. "A glass bead! But what does it mean, Holmes? A child's toy?" "Hardly, Inspector," Holmes replied, his eyes now sweeping the room again, taking in the various furnishings, the ornaments, the attire of the remaining guests who, though confined to a nearby salon, were now being brought in for questioning. "It means, Lestrade, that someone else, quite apart from Miss Fairchild, was present at the scene, and during the 10 seconds of darkness shed this small, yet highly significant item." He then instructed Lestrade to bring in all the ladies who had been present in the drawing-room during the game. Among them I immediately recognized Miss Isabella Thorpe, a young woman of undeniable beauty, but whose expression, even in repose, held a certain sharp, competitive edge. Her gown, a veritable confection of silk and lace, was adorned with an astonishing array of intricate beadwork, glittering and sparkling in the subdued light of the drawing-room. Holmes, with a courteous bow, addressed the ladies, reassuring them that their presence was merely for clarification. But his eyes, I noticed, lingered on Miss Thorpe, his gaze dissecting her attire with an almost surgical precision. "Miss Thorpe," Holmes began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I understand you were also participating in the game of blind man's bluff last night." Miss Thorpe gave a stiff nod. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, it was all so gay until it wasn't." Her voice, though carefully modulated, carried a faint undertone of resentment. "And your attire, madam," Holmes continued, his gaze still fixed upon her, "is quite exquisite. Such remarkable beadwork. Did you perhaps carry a fan or any other accessory similarly adorned?" Miss Thorpe stiffened almost imperceptibly. "I did, Mr. Holmes. A rather splendid fan, a gift from my aunt. It matches my dress, you see." She held up her gloved hand, revealing the closed fan, its delicate silk folds almost entirely obscured by a breathtaking tapestry of glittering beads. It was indeed a work of art, a testament to intricate craftsmanship. Holmes merely inclined his head. "Indeed. And you wear a rather fashionable hatpin, I observe." His gaze flickered to her coiffure. Miss Thorpe's hand went instinctively to her hair, then froze. A faint blush crept up her neck. I did, Mr. Holmes, but I seem to have misplaced it. Perhaps in the confusion last night. A rather striking piece with a small jet-black top." Holmes's eyes, which had been almost veiled, now gleamed with renewed vigour. "Indeed, Miss Thorpe. A regrettable loss. Now, if you would be so kind as to permit me a closer inspection of your fan." Miss Thorpe hesitated, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes, but then, with a forced smile, she offered the fan to Holmes. He took it, handling it with extreme care, his magnifying glass instantly at work. He examined the beadwork with meticulous attention, tracing the patterns, his fingers gently probing the delicate fastenings. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured. "And this beadwork, Miss Thorpe, I observe, incorporates various types of beads, seed pearls, tiny crystals, and glass beads, remarkably similar to the one I discovered on the floor." He held up the recovered bead to the fan, showing the striking resemblance. Miss Thorpe's face was now ashen. She snatched the fan back, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. "What are you implying, Mr. Holmes?" she demanded, her voice rising. Holmes ignored her outburst, turning to Lestrade. "Inspector, I believe we have our weapon and our motive and indeed our perpetrator." I stared at Holmes, my mind racing, attempting to piece together the disparate fragments. The glass bead, the pearl necklace, the hatpin, the fan, the rivalry. It was all there, tantalizingly close. Yet the complete picture still eluded me. Holmes, sensing my struggle, and with a slight smile of indulgence, turned to the assembled guests, his voice now ringing with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, the death of Miss Evelyn Fairchild was no accident, nor was it the work of some unseen spectre in the darkness. It was murder, a calculated, cunning act executed under the perfect cover of a playful diversion. He then began to weave his narrative, each sentence a precise logical step in the reconstruction of the crime. Miss Fairchild, as we know, was a popular and charming debutante, undoubtedly the object of much admiration. Such admiration, however, can often breed jealousy, especially in the competitive arena of London society. It is no secret, I believe, that Miss Fairchild and Miss Isabella Thorpe harboured a considerable rivalry, particularly, if I'm not mistaken, for the affections of a certain Mr. Julian Thorne, who I observe is standing close by. Mr. Thorne, a handsome young man, visibly recoiled, his face flushing deep red. Miss Thorpe merely glared at Holmes, her eyes burning. "The game of blind man's bluff," Holmes continued, "was a stroke of genius, albeit a malevolent one. It provided the ideal conditions: a darkened room, the confusion of movement, the expectation of physical contact, and above all, the brief, crucial moment of complete darkness. In those 10 seconds, when the room was plunged into absolute shadow, the deed was done." He held up the glass bead. "This bead, found precisely where Miss Fairchild fell, is not from her pearl necklace. It is, however, identical to the beads adorning Miss Thorpe's exquisite fan, which she held in her hand last night. In the struggle, as she plunged the weapon into Miss Fairchild's neck, a bead from the fan, perhaps loosened by the impact, fell to the floor, an innocuous yet damning piece of evidence." "Struggle? Weapon?" Lestrade interjected, utterly bewildered. "But there was no weapon found, Holmes, and a mere pinprick wound." "Indeed, Inspector," Holmes acknowledged. "The weapon was designed to be both subtle and easily concealed, and then immediately rendered innocuous or disposed of. Consider, Lestrade, Miss Thorpe's missing hatpin. A sharp, slender object capable of inflicting precisely the wound we observe on Miss Fairchild's neck. But a hatpin alone, even a poison one, would be too easily discovered if simply thrust into the victim's flesh. No, the delivery mechanism was far more ingenious." Holmes walked over to Miss Thorpe, his gaze unwavering. "The hatpin, Miss Thorpe, was not simply held in your hand. It was, I submit, cunningly concealed within the intricate beadwork of your fan. You, anticipating the game and the opportune darkness, extracted the hatpin, perhaps having previously coated its tip with a fast-acting, undetectable poison, a potent alkaloid, I should venture, capable of inducing cardiac arrest with minimal trace. In the dark, amidst the playful chaos, you approach Miss Fairchild, using the very fan as a distraction or a shield, and with a swift, precise movement you plunge the poisoned hatpin into her neck. A fleeting touch, mistaken perhaps for a playful prod, or the brush of a stranger in the dark. The tiny puncture, the rapid absorption of the toxin, and then death." Eleanor Blackwood, who had been watching us with a mixture of apprehension and forced composure, let out a small, sharp gasp. "Wax? But it looked precisely like blood. We all saw it." "The visual deception, madam, was doubtless intended," Holmes stated, fixing her with a penetrating gaze. "A theatrical flourish designed to play upon the known superstitions of Sir Hugo and to divert suspicion from the true nature of the event." Alistair stepped forward, a frown creasing his brow. "But if it was not a natural occurrence, then what caused the explosion?" "That, Mr. Blackwood, is the logical progression of our inquiry. Holmes replied. Pine sawdust suggests drilling. Red wax suggests a sealant for a cavity. An explosion of this magnitude suggests a high-yield propellant. Put them together and the pattern begins to emerge, does it not? A drilled log, filled with explosive material and sealed with a theatrical bleeding device. Before Holmes could continue, a heavy tread sounded from the main door, and a gruff voice called out, "Mrs. Blackwood? Is all in order here?" A man of powerful build, with a weathered face and hands like gnarled oak roots, entered the hall. This was Silas Croft, the groundskeeper. He carried a heavy-duty axe and had an air of dour competence. As he spoke to Eleanor, I noticed something peculiar. A fresh, angry-looking burn on the back of his right hand, just above the knuckles. It was a circular blistered mark, clearly recent. "Ah, Mr. Croft," Holmes interjected, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You are the gentleman who cut the Yule log, I presume?" Silas turned, his gaze wary, flickering from Holmes to the charred hearth. "Aye, that I am, from the Whispering Grove, as Sir Hugo insisted. He was particular about his traditions." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly as they fell upon the groundskeeper's injured hand. "A nasty burn you have there, Mr. Croft. How did you come by it?" Silas quickly tucked his hand behind his back, a faint flush rising to his rough cheeks. "Oh, that? Just a bit of a kitchen mishap, sir. Burned myself on a hot pan whilst helping the cook prepare supper last night." "Indeed," Holmes said, his tone giving nothing away. "Cooking, you say? A most unfortunate accident." He then turned his attention back to Eleanor and Alistair, seemingly dismissing the groundskeeper, though I knew better. The burn had not escaped his notice, nor, I suspected, had the man's sudden evasiveness. Over the next few hours, Holmes conducted his interviews. Eleanor Blackwood spoke of her late husband as an intimidating, demanding man, increasingly consumed by his eccentricities. She claimed to be utterly bewildered by the tragedy, clinging to the supernatural explanation as a comfort. Her grief seemed genuine enough, but beneath it I detected a certain detachment, a practicality that belied her dramatic pronouncements. She was, after all, the principal beneficiary of Sir Hugo's will, a fact Alistair was quick to point out, though he immediately retracted it as unseemly. Alistair, for his part, was open about his strained relationship with his father. He had returned to Blackwood Manor only recently, having fallen into financial difficulties. He admitted his father held the purse strings tightly, and his inheritance would be substantial. He expressed his suspicion of a foul play, but could offer no concrete theories, merely a general distrust of his stepmother and, surprisingly, a vague unease about Silas Croft, whom he described as too loyal by half. Silas Croft, when finally brought before Holmes, was laconic and unforthcoming. He repeated his story about the Yule log, the bleeding and the explosion, offering no additional insight. He maintained his cooking accident story for the burn, though he seemed uncomfortable under Holmes's direct gaze. Holmes pressed him on the cutting of the log, the tools used, its transportation, but Silas remained resolutely vague on any specifics that might shed light on a cavity or tampering. Holmes, during these interviews, was a silent, watchful presence, occasionally interjecting with a single incisive question that often seemed to throw the interviewee off balance. He noted the subtle glances between Eleanor and Silas, a fleeting connection of eyes when Sir Hugo's difficult nature was mentioned, or when the details of the explosion were recounted. It was nothing concrete, merely an impression, a flicker of something shared that went beyond employer and employee, stepmother and groundskeeper. That afternoon, Holmes took me aside. "Watson, my dear fellow, while I complete a few chemical tests back in the manor, I want you to make discreet inquiries. First, visit the local public house. Gossip is often a truer mirror of local affairs than any official report. See if there is any rumour, any whisper concerning Mrs. Blackwood and the groundskeeper. Secondly, ascertain, if you can, the whereabouts and activities of Silas Croft last night, especially after the fatal event. Did he truly assist in the kitchen, or was his presence elsewhere?" I set off into the gathering dusk, feeling the old familiar thrill of being Holmes's confidant and assistant. My enquiries at the Blackwood Arms were fruitful. Over a pint of ale, the landlord, a garrulous man with a nose for local intrigue, was more than happy to elaborate on the unnaturalness of the old baronet's marriage to a woman young enough to be his daughter, and the growing rumour that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood and Silas Croft had for some time been rather more than mere acquaintances. "Always together they were, Doctor." "Watson," the landlord confided, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "even when Sir Hugo was alive. Not that Sir Hugo ever noticed, too busy with his curses and his logs. As for Silas's whereabouts after the explosion, the cook at the manor, a Mrs. Gubbins, informed me that Silas had not, in fact, been in the kitchen. No, sir, she stated emphatically. Mr. Croft went straight out after that dreadful bang. Said he needed air. Didn't see him again for near an hour, and he certainly didn't help with supper. Left me to clear up the mess entirely on my own." Armed with this information, I returned to Blackwood Manor, my pulse quickening. Holmes was waiting for me in the drawing-room, a triumphant glint in his eyes. He had a small glass phial in his hand containing a tiny solidified lump of red wax. "Your investigations appear to confirm my suspicions, Watson," he said, laying out several fragments of charred wood on a white cloth. "This wax, you see, it contains a minute trace of carbon and sulphur, consistent with the residue of a common blasting powder. The pine sawdust, found deep within the oak grain, indicates a drilling process. The burn on Croft's hand. It is not from a hot pan, I assure you. I subjected a sample of the wax taken from the hearth to careful analysis. It requires significant heat to melt and flow, yet not so much that it would instantly ignite gunpowder. The timing, Watson, was everything." He then, with a flourish, produced a small, perfectly cylindrical piece of wood from his coat pocket. "And this, my dear fellow, found wedged deep within one of the larger fragments of the log, speaks volumes. It is a wooden plug, Watson, made of pine, designed to conceal the borehole after the explosive had been packed in and the wax poured." "So it was gunpowder," I exclaimed, "and the wax was to create the illusion of bleeding." "Precisely," Holmes affirmed. "The log was drilled, packed with blasting powder, and then the borehole was carefully filled with molten red wax, topped with a pine plug. As the fire took hold, the initial heat melted the wax, allowing it to ooze out, creating the macabre spectacle Sir Hugo so readily believed in. This was a critical misdirection, a clever appeal to his superstition, ensuring no one would suspect the true, more mundane, and infinitely more sinister mechanism at work. The log would bleed, fulfilling the curse. And then, once the heat had penetrated deeper, igniting the gunpowder, the explosion would follow, completing the supernatural tableau. But who, Holmes? Who would devise such an elaborate and cruel scheme? Holmes settled back in his chair, his expression grave. The motive, as is so often the case, Watson, lies at the intersection of avarice and desire. Sir Hugo, as we know, stood between two individuals and their combined ambitions: his young wife, Eleanor, and his groundskeeper, Silas Croft. You mean? Indeed, Watson. Your inquiries at the public house merely confirm my own observations. The glances, the subtle shifts in demeanour, the overly zealous defence of Sir Hugo's eccentricities from Eleanor, and Croft's evasiveness regarding his burn and his movements after the explosion. They are lovers, Watson, and Sir Hugo was an inconvenient obstacle. Eleanor inherits a considerable fortune. Silas, presumably, inherits Eleanor, and a degree of financial security he could only dream of as a mere groundskeeper. The burn on Croft's hand, then? I pressed. Could be from handling the hot drill bit, or even a minor flash from the explosion itself. He was the one who prepared the log, I have no doubt. His intimate knowledge of the wood, the grove, and the manor's traditions made him the ideal accomplice, or indeed the primary architect of the mechanism. Eleanor provided the motive, the access, and the alibi of collective bewilderment. Holmes paused, then rose, his lean figure outlined against the fading light from the window. The entire affair was a cunningly staged piece of theatre, designed to cloak a cold-blooded murder in the guise of a tragic supernatural event. The bleeding log, the explosion, the old baronet's demise, all carefully orchestrated. Sir Hugo's own superstitions were weaponized against him. Holmes requested that Eleanor Blackwood and Silas Croft meet us in the Great Hall. Alistair was also present, his face still etched with uncertainty. The atmosphere was taut, charged with unspoken suspicions. The remnants of the charred hearth seemed to glower in the dimming light. Holmes stood before them, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice resonating with an almost clinical detachment. "Madam, Mr. Croft, we have, I believe, unravelled the mystery of the bleeding Yule log." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance in their depths. Silas Croft merely stared impassively, though I noticed his hands were now clenched into fists. "The log, Sir Hugo's final fateful Yule log," Holmes began, "did not bleed by supernatural agency, nor did it explode through some freak internal combustion. It was, in fact, a meticulously crafted instrument of murder." Alistair gasped. Eleanor's face went pale, but she held Holmes's gaze. Silas remained a stony sentinel. Holmes laid out the small pine plug, the wax fragment, and the sample of pine sawdust upon a table. "This plug, gentlemen, was used to conceal a borehole drilled deep into the mighty oak log. This sawdust found amongst the oak is proof of that drilling. And this wax, which you all mistook for blood, was used to seal the explosive within that cavity." He paused, letting his words sink in. The log, you see, was packed with gunpowder. The initial heat of the fire melted the wax, causing it to ooze out, fulfilling the morbid prophecy Sir Hugo so eagerly anticipated. Only when the heat had penetrated further did the gunpowder ignite, causing the explosion that killed Sir Hugo. Eleanor let out a choked cry. "No! This is madness! It was a curse, I tell you!" "A convenient curse, madam," Holmes retorted, his voice hardening, "that removed an elderly, demanding husband and opened the door to a considerable inheritance. A curse that also incidentally removed the impediment to a burgeoning clandestine relationship." He fixed his gaze first on Eleanor, then on Silas. "Your affair, Mrs. Blackwood, with your groundskeeper, Silas Croft, is no secret to the local populace. Sir Hugo's demise was not merely convenient, it was orchestrated. Mr. Croft, your burn, which you so clumsily attributed to a kitchen accident, is consistent with either the flash of the gunpowder or the intense heat required to seal the borehole with molten wax. Your absence from the kitchen after the event, as confirmed by Mrs. Gubbins, further refutes your fabricated alibi." Silas Croft, who had been stiff as a statue, finally moved. His jaw clenched, and his eyes, usually so impassive, now blazed with a raw fury. "He was an old fool, always talking of his curses, his damned traditions. He never saw what was under his own nose." "Silence, Silas," Eleanor shrieked, her composure finally shattering. The veneer of polite grief vanished, revealing a woman cornered and desperate. "You fool, you absolute fool!" Holmes watched the unravelling with calm satisfaction. The motivation, as so often, is ancient as mankind itself. Greed and illicit passion. You believed, no doubt, that by playing upon Sir Hugo's known superstitions, the cause of death would be attributed to the supernatural, thus deflecting all suspicion. A truly ingenious, if utterly depraved scheme. Alistair Blackwood, who had been staring in shocked disbelief, now turned on Eleanor, his face a mask of horror. You murdered my father, with him, that brute!" The scene descended into chaos. Eleanor, her face contorted with rage and fear, hurled accusations back at Silas, blaming him for the idea, for the execution. Silas, now completely enraged, returned her vitriol, laying bare the full extent of their shared plan. Holmes merely stood back, allowing the truth to spill forth from the lips of the culprits themselves. He then calmly turned to me. "Watson, if you would be so kind as to fetch Constable Henderson. I believe he will find this evidence and these confessions rather more compelling than his previous supernatural theories." As Henderson, flustered and bewildered, arrived to take the guilty pair into custody, the last vestiges of Christmas goodwill seemed to drain from the ancient manor. The air hung heavy with the stench of betrayal and death. Back in the carriage, leaving Blackwood Manor fading into the snow-dusted landscape, I reflected on the dark irony of it all. "To think, Holmes," I mused, "that a man's own superstitions could be so cunningly exploited, used as the very instrument of his murder." Holmes nodded, gazing out at the deepening twilight. "Indeed, Watson, human nature, in all its complexity, remains the most fascinating and perilous of landscapes. The bleeding Yule log was not a testament to the supernatural, but to the cold, calculating heart of man. A most unfestive resolution, perhaps, but a logical one nonetheless. Pass me the evening paper, Watson. I believe there is a chess problem that requires my attention. Miss Thorpe had, by this point, collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands, her denials replaced by racking sobs. The meticulously planned deception, designed to vanish in the festive chaos, had been laid bare by the relentless logic of Holmes's mind. "And the weapon, Holmes?" I asked as Lestrade, with a renewed sense of purpose, began to take statements and secure the room. "Where is the hatpin now?" Holmes merely smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "A minor detail, Watson, easily disposed of in the confusion. Perhaps dropped into a vase of water, or concealed within the folds of a curtain, or even slipped into the pocket of an unsuspecting guest during the general panic. But the absence of the hatpin itself, coupled with the glass bead and the evident motive, points to only one conclusion. The means, the opportunity, the malice, all are accounted for. The puncture wound, the rapid demise, the peculiar setting, all pieces of a singular, murderous puzzle." He then addressed Miss Thorpe, whose sobs had quieted to a shuddering silence. "Miss Thorpe, I advise you to confess. The evidence, though circumstantial to the untrained eye, is to my science irrefutable. You allowed your jealousy to fester, to blossom into a deadly intent. The darkness provided the stage, and the festive mistletoe, a bitter irony, marked the spot of your cruel act. You intended to inflict not a kiss, but death beneath its boughs." With a final broken cry, Miss Thorpe looked up, her eyes wide with terror and defeat. She was always the preferred one. Julian, everything. I hated her. I hated her smile, her laughter, her effortless charm. She stole everything from me. Lestrade, recovering his composure, stepped forward. "Miss Thorpe, you are under arrest for the murder of Miss Evelyn Fairchild." It was well past midnight when Holmes and I at last found ourselves back in the familiar sanctuary of Baker Street. The city, though still alive with the distant echoes of Yuletide revelry, now felt blessedly quiet after the emotional turmoil of the Ashworth residence. I stirred the dying embers of the fire. The image of young Miss Fairchild, so vibrant and then so still, lingering in my mind. "A truly diabolical scheme, Holmes," I remarked, pouring myself a glass of claret. "To use the very spirit of Christmas, the innocent games and traditions, as a cloak for such a heinous crime. And that hatpin, so simple, yet so effective." Holmes, already lost in thought, was deftly reassembling his chemical apparatus, the pungent odour of which now filled the room. "Indeed, Watson, it merely illustrates the truth that the most cunning crimes are often those that employ the most commonplace implements and the most natural human settings. The festive season, far from being a time of universal goodwill, often merely accentuates the deepest human flaws. Jealousy, my dear fellow, is a potent poison, capable of transforming a mere ornament into a deadly weapon, and a playful kiss into a harbinger of death." He held up a small, empty phial, his keen eyes catching the faint glint of the gaslight. "The specific toxin, I believe, will prove to be aconite. Easily acquired, incredibly potent, and leaves little trace in a rapid fatality. A choice indicative of a mind both desperate and, in its own twisted way, remarkably calculating." I shook my head, marvelling once again at the intricate web of deceit and passion that Holmes had so effortlessly unravelled. The contrast, Holmes, between the glittering ball, the promise of a mistletoe kiss, and the cold reality of murder is truly stark. Holmes settled back into his armchair, a contented sigh escaping his lips. The greater the contrast, Watson, the more compelling the case. For beneath the superficial gaiety of society, the currents of human emotion flow deep and dark. It is my task to navigate those currents, to strip away the illusion, and to expose the stark, unvarnished truth. And in this particular instance, the truth was found not in a ghostly apparition, but in a small glass bead and a missing hatpin, lost amidst the fleeting shadows of a Christmas ball. Now, Watson, if you would be so kind as to pass me that volume on the taxonomy of rare poisons, I believe there are a few lingering points of interest that I should like to explore.